She hadn't spoken in days, not because the words weren't there, but because every syllable she wanted to scream had already drowned in the silence left behind by the sea. The same sea that stole her father, her hero, her everything, with one unforgiving wave, and as she sat curled up by the window, her tiny fingers wrapped around a soaked red and yellow beach ball, her tearless eyes staring at the horizon like it owed her an explanation, the world watched and wept, because what started as a family beach day turned into a viral tragedy that shattered the internet and ripped a father's love straight from a child's arms. And when the silence finally cracked, when her lips trembled and her voice rasped from the pit of her chest, it wasn't a scream or a sob or even a question. It was 5 words soaked in memory and grief. I miss my daddy. He said he'd come back, and with that whisper, the dam broke, not just in her, but across millions of hearts that had been holding their breath since the footage surfaced, since the wave rose, since Malcolm-Jamal Warner, the beloved actor, father, and man whose laughter once filled sitcom living rooms and now echoed through funeral hymns, vanished beneath the surface of an angry ocean, chasing after nothing more than a drifting toy and a promise. And it was that promise, that smile, that final tender nod of "Don't worry, baby girl. Daddy's got it." That became the last image etched into his daughter's mind. The image that would replace bedtime stories, silly dances in the living room, and harmonized car ride songs with the kind of silence that no lullaby could reach. Because while others saw a beach ball, a gust of wind, and a noble mistake, she saw betrayal by the very universe that once gave her a father, and then snatched him away in the name of sacrifice. And when rescuers finally pulled him from the water 11 minutes too late, his arms were still wrapped around the ball as if even in death, he refused to break his word, and that image, his lifeless body cradling that absurd plastic sphere, would not only splinter the digital world, but resurrect him as something more than a man, more than a dad, a legend carved into the heart of every grieving child who ever said goodbye too soon. And while fans flooded timelines with clips of Malcolm from The Cosby Show, remembering the laughter, the warmth, the legacy, his daughter clutched his soaked sweater each night like it still smelled of safety, curled beside a napkin scrawled with childlike grief. He didn't die saving the world. He died saving my world, and if you think that's dramatic, you're not ready for what happened next, because when someone sent the family a video captured by a stranger, grainy, shaky, yet painfully clear, it wasn't just the moment Malcolm dove into the sea. It was the moments before, the ones that changed everything, because it showed him outside his daughter's school arguing with a hooded man, shielding her, shoving the stranger backward just before the screen went black, and in that blink, the entire narrative shifted. Because now Malcolm wasn't just a drowning victim. He was a man marked, a father who knew danger was near and chose to stay, to fight, to shield, to die standing between harm and his child. And when the footage played in court during the trial, seeking justice against the negligence that allowed danger to simmer beneath that beach's calm waves, torn warning signs, no lifeguard, no red flags, the air turned ice cold, and even the judge, known for steely resolve, paused, because the grainy footage didn't lie. Malcolm-Jamal Warner was targeted, perhaps stalked, and undeniably brave, and as the courtroom absorbed the shock, the defense dared to argue coincidence, randomness, that perhaps Malcolm simply misjudged a current or took a bad step. And that's when she stood, the girl with the beach ball, the broken voice, the soul now forged in grief, and said no. He knew. He told me to go inside. He told me to lock the door and not look back. He didn't just die. He chose to stand between me and death. And those words, so soft yet so sharp, shattered the court like glass under the weight of truth, with reporters choking back emotion, jurors wiping eyes, and her grandmother collapsing into screams of agony that echoed like thunder through the room. And still she did not cry, not until later, when she stood in the center of the courtroom, shaking, fists clenched, shoulders heavy with a universe she never asked to carry, and her knees gave out. And from the pit of her chest came the kind of scream that doesn't belong to a child, the kind of scream that tears at the fabric of time itself. And that scream, the courtroom cry, was caught on audio, uploaded, shared, looped, dissected, and mourned by millions. A global wound split open by one child's unbearable loss. Hashtags erupted. Justice for Jamal. She didn't cry until now. He died for her. But just when the world thought the storm had passed, when it assumed the final note had been sung and the last tear had been shed, life, as it always does, twisted again. This time not with fury, but with something quieter, more corrosive. Doubt. Because after the funeral, after the courtroom cry that broke the internet, after the viral song that sounded like heaven whispering through heartbreak, the questions began to outlive the answers. And as fans built digital shrines and nightly vigils burned across beaches from California to Ghana, Malcolm-Jamal Warner's daughter remained both a symbol and a mystery, her face frozen on news channels and murals alike. Her silence now a language the world couldn't translate, and while media personalities speculated, bloggers dissected every second of the funeral footage, and influencers milked content from a child's trauma. She was somewhere far quieter, somewhere sacred, clutching her father's chain as if it still pulsed with his heartbeat, sleeping on the floor of his dusty studio because beds felt too soft for grief this sharp. And that's where she found it. The box, tucked beneath floorboards behind an old amp cabinet, wrapped in a torn studio towel and sealed with electrical tape like someone had hidden not just belongings, but truths. And inside were pieces of a man the world thought they knew. Photographs with unfamiliar faces, letters he'd never mailed, recordings labelled only with dates and a journal, a torn, half-charred leather notebook whose pages flipped like time itself, each one filled with regret and longing and warnings written in Malcolm's unmistakable handwriting. Entries like, "I think I'm being followed," and "They said she wasn't safe," and "If anything happens to me, check the third drawer." And suddenly her entire body went cold, because this wasn't a coincidence, wasn't fate, wasn't just waves and fire. This was targeted, and what had looked like a random accident was now cracking open into a conspiracy so big she almost couldn't breathe beneath it. And when she did open the third drawer, she found not just old headphones and microphone cables, but an envelope, one addressed to "My daughter, for when you're ready to know the truth." And her hands shook as she opened it. Breath caught in her throat, and inside was a letter so devastating it rewrote everything she thought she knew about love, fear, protection, and the man who used to kiss her forehead and sing off-key lullabies. Because in that letter, Malcolm confessed not just to secrets, but to a war, a quiet war with men in suits who called themselves investors but acted more like shadowy creditors. Partners from his past who once helped fund his early independent projects, but turned darker when Malcolm refused to sell out, refused to give them creative control, refused to let them use his daughter's image in a licensing deal he never agreed to. And from that moment on, he'd been followed, threatened, and finally cornered, forced into silence by contracts, lawyers, and a looming custody case that could have stolen her from him if he ever spoke publicly. And he had been protecting her, not just from drowning or burning, but from them, from a machine too big for one man to fight, and yet he fought anyway, every day, every moment, until the final one. And with that knowledge now branding itself into her ribs, she did the only thing a child raised by a fighter could do. She fought back, not with violence, but with truth, because the world had already listened to her song, cried to her courtroom scream. But now, they would hear everything, and so she returned to court, not as a witness, not as a grieving child, but as a plaintiff, represented by a legal team assembled in secret by her aunt, civil rights attorneys, media ethics experts, digital privacy watchdogs, and within days, they filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit not just against the beachfront property for their negligence, but against the investment firm whose name appeared on the bottom of Malcolm's torn contracts. The same firm linked to other shady artists silencing allegations. And as the press caught wind of the story's new twist, headlines exploded. Warner death not an accident? See, Malcolm was fighting something darker. Daughter files suit, exposes secret war. And while late-night hosts turned their monologues serious and Oprah's production team reached out for a potential sit-down, she stayed focused, not for fame, not for attention, but for him. For the father who died twice and still didn't leave her, and in preparation for the next hearing, She sat with those recordings, those dated tapes from the box, listening to her father pour his soul into microphones in the middle of the night, his voice raw, scared, angry, protective, saying things like, "If anything happens to me, tell her none of this was her fault. Tell her she was my reason for everything." And with every word, her spine straightened, her grief. They said time would heal her, that the ache would soften, that the nightmares would slow down, and the weight on her chest would become bearable. But no one told her that grief doesn't vanish. It mutates. It burrows. It follows you into adulthood like a shadow stitched to your heels. And now, years later, after the courtrooms emptied and the hashtags faded into archived posts, Malcolm-Jamal Warner's daughter stood at the edge of the same shoreline where she last saw her father breathing, the same beach that stole him, renamed now in his honor, Warner Cove, but still echoing with that same guttural scream she let out the moment his body was pulled from the waves. And in her hand was that beach ball, now faded and patched, like her memories, scarred but stubbornly intact, and behind her stood a quiet crowd. Her aunt, the attorneys who helped her win justice, the producers who never got the rights to her song, and just a few feet back, the boy who had once been a stranger in a funeral pew, now her brother, grown, taller than her by inches, holding the same journal their father left behind, his eyes wide, not with grief, but with the curiosity of someone raised on legend and finally staring at flesh. Because in the years since Malcolm's death, his children had done more than survive. They built a life forged in fractured truth and repaired it with forgiveness, and it wasn't easy. Children of firefighters, of soldiers, of fathers who died protecting. They sent letters, videos, art, and slowly she began replying, sometimes just with a heart, sometimes with a verse, and sometimes with a voice memo where she simply said, "I see you. You're not alone." And even though she rarely gave interviews, she made one exception on what would have been her father's 70th birthday. She sat down for a short film, no host, no studio lights, just her father's sweater, and a handheld camera. She looked straight into the lens and said, "He wasn't perfect. He lied. He hid things. But he never stopped protecting me, not even in death. And if there's one thing I want the world to remember, it's this. Sometimes love looks like sacrifice. Sometimes heroes aren't born. They burn." And with that, she stood, walked off camera, and the screen faded to black. The internet shattered again. The world reminded, and the letters doubled. Grown men wrote in, sharing stories of how they started therapy